Good morning. I'm Teresa Mitchell. This is now Bridge to a Better World, and it's about 9:01. Let's get started, shall we? Good morning, John. Good morning, Ani. Oh, by the way, I'm here by myself. Ani's still in Mexico, and if you look around, there's a possibility you can get a tarot reading here. Back in 1989, not 1889, but in 1989, the last century, when George Bush the Greater was president, a Canadian man named Ray Blanchard came up with his personal explanation of transgender women. Ray was a bit of a crank, so he published his ideas in a journal, and for at least a decade, there was a spirited debate on his theory of autogynephilia, which is not what happens, as you might suspect, to your automobile tires if you fail to change them annually. It's called autogynephilia, AGP. His idea was that AGP was a paraphilia, basically a way of saying that trans women are insane men with an unstoppable perversion. Blanchard had a cohort of trans women, which he called men, and some men who were not trans, and he asked them questions of what they thought would turn them on about their bodies as masculine or feminine. Other sexologists, not without some humor, pointed out that his definitions would apply to most women, as it is not possible to have a healthy sex drive without having some erotic feeling in one's own attractiveness, and the poor man in this silly idea would have been long forgotten. Were it not for another man named Bailey, who wrote the Turf Bible, called The Man Who Would Be Queen, and that was also long ago, 1990s. After all these years, the whole discussion would be silly to bring up. But that's exactly what the British and now American turf haters are doing. Furthermore, they refer to trans women as AGPs, as in, there's an AGP. There's an AGP. I don't want him peeping in my theater bathroom. I wish I was exaggerating. So now you're going to hear this new old slur, which has the frisson of science. But the science waved goodbye to autogynephilia a generation ago. And you can be sure that when you see any discussion of it outside that context, you're in the presence of a hater. And the real science is psychoneuroendocrinology and the DSM-5. There is a mention of AGP in the DSM-5, which is a manual for psychologists. And it was put there by a ferocious turf rump faction that during the negotiations for the book insisted that it still exists, but the main body of transgender research in the DSM makes it plain that the old crank theory just doesn't apply in any general sense. So whenever you hear a turf, you hear a hater talk about science against transgender people, well, it's time to pull out the real science and have a bit of a study. And this applies to a lot of subjects. The publication Inside Climate News says crypto miners, specifically about 130 gigantic multi-floor operations, are incredibly sucking up 1 watt in every 50 watts in the United States. We knew they were big. Did you know they were that big? This is particularly damaging in Texas, where the titanic stacks of computers are driving up the price of electricity daily due to Texas's electricity demand pricing law, in which grandma pays for power as if she were ordering an Uber. 2% of all power generated in the U.S. is an astonishing amount, and it seems to me that it should be banned in view of the fact that the rest of us who cannot drop hundreds of millions of dollars on decrypting blockchain would prefer to breathe regularly and not die in heat domes. Well, there will be a tarot reading posted later this afternoon. Thank you, Ani. Hello, Tat. So you may not have heard, unless you watched Democracy Now! In their interview with Jeremy Scahill, that Britain's Channel 4 obtained the famous Israeli pseudo-spy document and found that it, quote, provides no evidence, as in no evidence, to support its explosive new claim that UNRWA staff were involved with terror attacks on Israel. It's bullshit. I mean, you kind of knew that it was, right? I mean, sure, the UN is getting in on terror attacks on Israel. No. The UN has a great deal to do with supporting Israel, helping Israel to happen. No, I won't go into that. But Scahill further notes that the October 7th attack, which in part was intended to take hostages, was greatly exaggerated by Israeli war propaganda and used to promote a story of intentional warfare rape. And in a reflection of the imaginary incubator babies of the Kuwait invasion, who remembers that but us geezers, there's a story of beheaded babies. I can't remember the specific number, 5 or 6 beheaded babies. This is also bullshit. But they've been repeated this claim has been repeated by world leaders, including Biden. Now, this is not to say that the breakout from the Gaza prison wasn't brutal. And I have no love for Hamas. Quoting Scahill, the Israeli Social Security Agency began to actually document the deaths on October 11th. They documented 1,139 deaths from the October 7th attack. 695 of them were civilians, which means that hundreds were soldiers. And we started reviewing the public documentation of the deaths. He writes, it turns out there was only one infant that was killed in all of the attacks combined on October 7th, a 9-month-old baby named Mila Cohen, and she was hit by a bullet during gunfire while she was in her mother's arm, end quote. So it's horrible enough, but it's clear now from evidence leaked from Netanyahu's camp that it was known that Hamas would break out, and in the manner that they did. This was not a secret to them. And they had prepared for it. That event was allowed to happen so that a standing plan long practiced in military training exercises to the extent of having a countryside mock-up of Gaza could be brought into fruition. And that plan was the complete removal and genocide of the Gaza population. We see this now taking effect, as around 30,000 are dead, and the rest of the population is currently being deprived of emergency medical care and even food. They're being starved to death within the Gaza walls. Meanwhile, it's literally true that real estate agents are putting ads online from Israel about what wonderful plans and buildings they plan to put up on the beach, and they sneer that they'll make the place really nice, apparently and conveniently forgetting that it was really nice before Israel occupied it, and there were hotels on the beach. Bernie Sanders quote about this on the 6th in a speech in D.C. Said, and yet today there's a bipartisan consensus here in Congress that at least $14 billion, including $10 billion more in unrestricted military aid, should go to this right-wing Israeli government. How in God's name, if I quote Bernie, should I do Bernie gestures? How in God's name can the United States condemn Russia's indiscriminate bombing, okay, I'll drop it, of civilians in Ukraine as a war crime and yet fund Netanyahu's war machine, which has killed thousands of children? How can we criticize the terrible human rights record of China, Iran, and other authoritarian countries, but ignore the human rights of the Palestinian people, end quote. Quoting Alex Wong in these times, buried within the $106 billion supplemental national security funding request the White House sent to Congress on October 20th was a highly unusual exemption. As part of the $3.5 billion earmarked for foreign military financing funding for Israel, the executive branch sought permission to unilaterally blanket approve the future sale of military equipment and weapons like ballistic missiles and artillery ammunition to Israel without notifying Congress. This means the Israeli government would be able to purchase up to $3.5 billion in military articles and services in complete secrecy. The House included the waiver language in a bill that splits off Israeli military aid from the rest of the package. And that brings me to the end of my notes for comments for today. So I see that Trotsky still rocks. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot to read about Trotsky. So thank you for tuning in. This is going to be abbreviated, as you can see. And do look for Ani's mundane tarot reading. Mundane as in its topic. And hope to see you next week. And until then, my love goes out to you and to all the ships at sea. Do you agree, Drinky Bird? Oh, I see that he does agree. That's good. He's a very agreeable fellow. He's very persistent in that regard. And yes, please poke those like buttons so it'll go up in the algorithm. And if you haven't subscribed, well, there you go. Bye bye. See y'all later.